So welcome everybody. I hope you are enjoying Soccerex this year. We are very happy, glad to come back here to Miami. I think all of us has some difficult times within the last years, so we are really proud and happy to bring you here again. And I'm more proud and happy because I have this stellar team here with me. We are trying humbly to cover many aspects related to the growth of the market in North America, particularly in the US, but also North America in general. So here, I know you all the names. We have Erica, we have Richard, we have Andrea, and we have Mark here. Their credentials, I'm sure that you already studied, but now you're going to be able to hear from them their experience. And let's begin by Richard. I want to know why and which are the reasons why this growth seems so organic, so organized, and it's moving forward the market, especially in America and particularly with the Major League Soccer. Why do you think that it's happening now at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think in one word I would say investment, right? And I think it's also a bit of vision because historically, you know, if you think about MLS versus other leagues across the world, especially in the lower divisions, they need to sell players. They need to transfer players in order to continue their growth and their evolution. And that's been part of the structure of those leagues for not decades, but in 100+ years in some cases. We're an MLS, which doesn't, you know, is got a league that's got, you know, a limited number of clubs and owners who are, you know, understandably interested on winning every year. Selling players was never really part of the original, you know, vision and, you know, evolution of what the league was trying to do. But now as the league is becoming more evolved, as the league is growing, they also understand that there's a pathway for young players who want to start their careers here and go overseas. And, you know, some clubs have shown a much better, you know, ability and interest and desire to sell players, such as FC Dallas and my friend Andre here. But I think more and more you're going to see these moves happening.
Can you give us some figures, just the top ones, in terms of selling and buying players recently?
Yeah, I think we'll turn that to Andre. He's sold more players than anybody. Why don't you give us all the inside info?
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, the figures are raising every year, increasing. The clubs in MLS in general are being able to sell players at higher numbers. And we recently made the highest transfer of a homegrown player directly from MLS to Europe. It was Ricardo Pepi. It was a figure around $20 million. And we have been transferring players since 2019, January 2019. Only in January 2020, the only window that we did not sell a player. Every other window, FC Dallas was able to sell players, and most of those players are players that came from our academy. And Richard was involved in the
American players or foreign players that you formed?
Most of them American. We also sold Carlos Gresso, Ecuadorian national team players to Augsburg in Germany. But most of them, most of the transfers we made were from our homegrown players. We had Brian Reynolds going to Roma. We had Tanner Tasman going to Venezia, Pepe going to Augsburg, Chris Richards going to Bayern Munich, and Reggie Cannon going to Boa Vista. So most of them were players that we sold from our academy, but also we had a few others that were international players that were also transferred.
Okay.
And I just will add real quickly that every deal is different, right? They're all case by case. And we've sold players every window. I've got a couple of my colleagues out here as well who are certainly involved in all these deals. But for example, in this past January window, we had George Bello from Atlanta sold to Arminia Bielefeld in Bundesliga, and we had Matt Turner sold to Arsenal. And so the nice thing about these transfers is you're talking about different ages, different leagues, different individual circumstances, whether it's how much time they have left on their contract, are they a national team player or not. But the fact that clubs are showing a willingness to sell is also something that the European clubs have noticed too.
Okay, Mark, turning the look a little bit to to your league. I know that usually the Major League Soccer clubs, they will find players when they are hiring players mostly from South America. I know the targets of your leagues mostly when you bring someone from outside is from Central America, and you also have some share of marketing in Europe. You have some other focus on there. Can you explain us how does it work, and also the development of younger talents here in your academies?
For sure. I mean, we're a very inclusive league in terms of nationalities. We get a lot of players from the Caribbean, from South and North America as well. But there is a big focus on, as the two gents here have mentioned, about developing your own player and giving them the pathway, giving them the platform, and then the ability to sell them to different countries, different regions. I think the majority of younger players now have that desire to play in Europe. And I think that as for all of us, it is about finding talent, developing talent, and then giving them that pathway to succeed and blossom in their careers.
But you still consider your leagues more focusing on forming players than buying players, especially players that cost high amounts?
Yeah, I don't think we're quite ready to buy the big name players yet, but I think we're ready to be a selling league. We've already done some great deals to Real Sociedad in Spain, to Toulouse in France. There'll be a couple more good transfers coming through. So I think, again, the European teams are now looking at America for these talents. And, you know, if you want to be successful trading, you've got to be able to have the right coach that can develop the players and then the right model to sell them.
Is there a lot of movement between the Major League Soccer and the United Soccer League concerning transfer of players, or this is still small?
I think
market?
it's there is still a marketplace there. I think the internal market between the USL and the MLS is probably smaller than the market for the sale of players to Europe.
Okay. Erica, from your seat at FIFA, the boss there, do you see this movement, this growth of the American market, the North American market, particularly the American one? Do you see that in numbers, in figures, not only in terms of transfers, but also it reflects on the number of litigation or the cases that you deal in the FIFA tribunal? I mean, solidarity mechanism, training compensation. Can you feel it, this growth?
Yes, definitely. So first of all, I think in numbers of transfer and also volume, amounts paid, we can definitely see a growth, especially from 2020. So 2019 and 2020, where you can see this move. And it grew almost 200%. But also what we have here, just to let you know, in FIFA we have the transfer matching system, which we can then see all the transfer happening. But also in 2020 we included also amateur players, which gave us a better picture to the entire world. And then specifically in the US, you also see a huge amount of transfer being reflected in the system. And definitely in terms of value of transfers, they also went from, I think 2019 was about 40 million to 80 million. So there's a huge growing of transfer fee paid for transfer with engaging clubs in the US. But we're also seeing the other way around, players being transferred to the European market mostly. And regarding solidarity and training as well, so I think it was 17 and 18, there was no claim for training compensation and solidarity. And now we see around 20 each year. It's still, again, knowing that claims only if the club doesn't pay voluntarily, but we saw from 0 to 20, which is, it's a big number. And for sure, with the impact of more transfer, the result will be definitely more claims for solidarity and training compensation. And also what we didn't see in the past, so I've been in FIFA for 10 years now, and we hardly ever had cases involving US clubs. And now we do have claims for contractual disputes, for payment of transfer agreements, but also employment-related disputes slowly coming towards us. Although we can have the conversation about competence, but definitely we're seeing more and more US parties taking a trial with the FIFA dispute resolution system. I don't know if you want me to explain a bit of that, but we can talk about that later, that FIFA not only puts obligations on the affiliated, but also have this possibility of using the dispute resolution system that FIFA has up and has been on for more than 20 years now for all disputes that have an international dimension.
I'm quite sure that it's going to be a tough battle to convince MLS to submit their disputes to FIFA jurisdictional bodies, and I see that more quite acceptable for the philosophy of the United Soccer League. And can you explain us? I know there's a huge difference between the philosophy behind the scenes and in place actually in the two leagues. So can you tell us about the compliance would be easier with FIFA rules for the leagues, for the clubs that participate in your league, in your view? I know it's a hot topic, that's why I'm bringing this.
Yeah, I think the MLS, as everybody knows, is a single entity. So the league owns the players and the player contracts, whereas the USL are more, we're very similar to the rest of the world, how the clubs are structured. So the clubs own the players, they deal with the contracts. So in terms of dealing with FIFA, it's a lot more smooth for us to submit the forms, deal with the TMS. If there's any problems, we can go direct to FIFA. So it's probably a lot easier for our league to comply on the whole regulations. But I think there's a big sort of educational piece needed around training compensation, around solidarity payments, and the fact that it's a reward, not a punishment for developing players. Because when did it came in? It only came in 2019, and there's no internal training compensation. It's only external, and I think people have got to get their heads around this system, because it's only going to be more and more worthwhile as players get moved around the world.
Andrea, about this, you lived and you are living in, you experimented two worlds, entirely different. The FIFA system, which is in place all over the world, basically, except MLS, and the MLS. Can you tell any distinction that you think that is more positive in the system of MLS? For instance, the fact that the agreements are made between, for instance, a Brazilian player when he's being transferred to a Brazilian club with MLS instead of Dallas. Is that good for your club? Is that good for the league? Is that good for the activity of the league? How do you see that? Because you saw both situations.
Yeah, I see it's different when you work in a club and you can, as Marco was mentioning about USL, when you deal directly with the negotiations, the contracts, and we had a club until last year in USL League One, North Texas, and so we were dealing with the USL model, and the MLS. What I think it helps is MLS has a standard contract, the standard like and
boilerplate contract standard,
and bonus structure that you cannot, for every club you have to keep in that standard. You have to, there's no you cannot create anything different than what they have as option for the clubs. So in a way, I think it also makes it easier when you're negotiating and you know exactly the boundaries where you can go.
Okay.
And if sometimes there's a request from a club or that you're negotiating or a player, and it's important, I think, for everybody to understand it. Even though it's the league that centralizes the contracts and the players sign the contracts with MLS, the whole negotiation is the clubs that are dealing. I'm negotiating players to sign for FC Dallas, and then I submit to the league all the terms, but I know where I can go because the league, they establish what are the restrictions you have.
Was there any situation where you were not able to close the deal because of some limit imposed by the MLS in contrast with the desire of the selling club?
It never happened. We found a way. Like it happened with negotiating a deal to extend a contract that Richard represents a player, and sometimes we reach an agreement, right? It happened.
It always happens.
and then the league says no, like this is not possible. And we go back, we renegotiate, we find a solution. So we never got to a point where you could not
You had to give up.
find an agreement.
I mean,
but I heard you might know a lot more.
We're not blaming,
that.
you're not blaming MLS because we know that specifically the FA and the Premier League are also very strict with their rules.
Very clear.
Speaking.
But
So-
I guess
but
I have a
Richard,
couple
that's-
comments on all these points. Yeah, so
I want your view on that.
my view on this point is, you know, I mean, MLS, like all leagues, right? They're trying to get more, not only centralized, but they're trying to get more structured and, you know, have simplicity and say, okay, here's a blanket set of rules, or bonuses or salary, whatever, that everybody can live by. But again, ultimately, my job as an agent is I don't care at all about any of that, right? My job as an agent is to do what's in the best interest of my client, to try to get the best deal or the best situation, whatever it might be in that individual point. And so ultimately, it also comes down to what leverage you have, right? If you have a top young talented player that they really want to sign who has options somewhere else, you're going to say, I don't care if your bonus structure doesn't allow for that. If you don't give my client what they want, then my client will go elsewhere. And guess what? If they really want the player, they will find a way to work that out, right? And so that's, you know, our job as player representatives is to, of course, always put the client's interest first and not just accept status quo. Now, many times you do have to accept status quo because you don't have that leverage. You know, I also understand the philosophy of a team or a league saying, okay, we want to try to have this template, if you will, and treat everybody more or less the same. So you have to navigate your way through that. And the other point I would just make about the whole solidarity contributions and training comp, it's a very complicated, very interesting issue, practically, legally, et cetera, right? Because, you know, also legally in the United States, you know, it's not really permissible, right? If kids are under 18 years old and aren't, you know, technically aren't allowed to, you know, obviously contract on their behalf, you're now asking for training compensation for somebody who legally you didn't have a right to do so, one. And in many of these situations, the kids have actually paid to play, right? So the philosophy of asking for training comp when the kid is paid to be part of that club is ludicrous, right? Now listen, if somebody has, you know, given them a scholarship and paid all their training, then that's a different issue. But in pretty much every industry in the world, when young teenagers are in their craft, whether they're chefs or dancers or musicians, down the road, people aren't coming and saying, oh, you know, we want a piece of, you know, a transfer fee because we helped get you to where you got to, right? So but, you know, I understand the issues and it is a complicated situation. But
yeah, picking from there, that's an interesting point, is that this, I wouldn't say clash, but I would say that these different options of jurisdictions to solve the problems. And that will vary if you're speaking about Major League Soccer, US, and also in the rest of the world. So my question, Erica, and then I will provoke you first, but I want to listen from all of you, is a practical issue. We know that it's very difficult to impose the jurisdiction of FIFA decision-making bodies within the scope of TMS competence or jurisdiction, okay? We know that. There's no desire of MLS up to this point, as far as I know, to send the cases to be adjudicated by FIFA. Okay, but there's one situation that I think that MLS won't be able to escape. And I know the excuses already that probably are coming, but I want to provoke you. One of these is, since FIFA recognized the right of a foreign forming club to charge training compensation in a domestic transfer. So a player that is transferred from Dallas to Los Angeles Galaxy. It doesn't matter, in my point of view, if there's a transfer fee specifically of 5 million, 10 million. I'm sure it is an asset that is moving from a club to another. I don't know which kind of, if it's the right to have the first choice in the draft. I don't know, but it's an asset. So I see this coming. South American clubs will charge training compensation against the buying club in America in these cases. And then, in my point of view, as a lawyer of a Brazilian club, Argentinian, Uruguayan club, I can charge this American club before FIFA. Am I right?
Yes, you're right. So solidarity in training, the system applies to everyone. And that's a bit just to say in general that it comes with it. I know that the United States has its particularities. I'm from Brazil. Brazil has also its particularities. And the issue is that FIFA imposes the regulations or system that either you're in or you're out, right? It's the same if you're in MLS. So it's basically, if you want to be part of the system, you have many rights, but you also have obligations. And that means that training compensation and solidarity are one of the obligations of the club and one of the principles of the regulation of the status and transfer of players, which is the solidarity amongst the clubs and also returning the investments that the training clubs have put on to receive that back. So definitely if you have the claim, I'm sure there will be. And this, for the longest time, we had cases of training compensation that were, you know, kind of like put on hold and trying like, what do we do because of the Fraser Decree and the system in the US. But already one of the deciding bodies that we have, which is the Dispute Resolution Channel, the Football Tribunal, took a decision saying it applies, and the club, the American club that was contesting the obligation to pay training compensation couldn't prove that that would go against national law. And like every other club in the system, if there's an international dimension to it, so meaning in this case, it's a national transfer, but the training club is from another member association, they will be entitled to training compensation.
And why do you think that the clubs from MLS should rely or should be more interested to use FIFA jurisdictional tools? If they
I think definitely it's coming, and we already had some cases because, as we said, the market has grown and is growing, and you have more and more transfers or players that are breaching their contracts to go to Europe or the other way around. And one of the many advantages, I would say, of the FIFA dispute resolution system is a very fast track proceeding. You have judges that are specialized and will apply the regulations of FIFA, but also you have the advantage that if the player doesn't have the money to pay whatever they are told to do it, the new club will also be jointly liable. And I think that's a big advantage. We already had a few cases, of course, I'm not going to say names, but that actually after the player breached the contract, I think they did went to New York and they got, you know, a decision saying actually, you know, this applies, but then when it comes to FIFA to ask for the joint liability, you can't. You need to pick. We don't accept foreign shopping as the Football Tribunal says. So if you want the new club to be jointly liable, then you need to pick the FIFA system. And I think in the long run, that might play, you know, there'd be a card to say, look, if you want to make sure that this player is leaving, but it's going to be also easier to enforce, right? Because the decisions of FIFA, if the parties are not abiding by what was decided, immediately we can put a transfer ban. So also the execution of it, I think it's much easier than executing.
That's what I wanted to approach with you guys, is that we have plenty, and we see that, advantages of having FIFA jurisdictions in many sense, but for me, the most important one is the ability of FIFA to apply sporting sanctions with immediate effect, which you don't have in a ordinary court. So I mean, when you sell these players, I assume that in case of Major League Soccer is the one that has stand to sue, is the one that is, I don't know how it works, but
every player that we sold,
yeah,
we use it's always FIFA. We always include FIFA in the contract.
You use FIFA.
We always MLS. The transfer is between MLS and the foreign club. It's never FC Dallas. So when
but MLS doesn't have stand to sue before FIFA. So how would you do if
we currently have a case, one of the transfers that we made that we never got paid.
Okay.
We had to go to FIFA, and then we had the cases at the Court of Arbitration for Sport right now. But the jurisdiction.
What was the decision in the first instance? Denying jurisdiction.
No. It was accepting the jurisdiction. So I understand it's challenging, especially when you're saying about the domestic, because again, for whom as I'm a foreign guy working in MLS, and so it's hard sometimes to understand how the system works and those trading. We did the highest internal transfer in the history of the league recently with Paul Arriola from DC United. And it's not money. It's not
Let me ask
real
you
transfer.
something.
By the way,
Let me ask-
domestic people
Richard,
have troubles understanding.
Let me
Not
ask you
just
something. I want to put you guys in trouble, but what I want to put you in trouble. Just one question.
We
So
know.
when you sell a player, you want to be protected. MLS allows you to put the jurisdiction clause electing FIFA. But usually when you're buying a player,
No, we
MLS want us to put the jurisdiction of the Court of New York.
No, we also have FIFA.
Well, I have a question for Erica. So when a case
Recently,
Surprising.
we just signed a player from Independiente, Alan Velasco.
Yes.
And we have FIFA. We went all the recent players that we signed. Usually the selling clubs they demand.
The last 6
and I
months,
agree
I've
with you.
said-
For the sporting sanctions,
Yeah.
it's
No, I know, but I represented 2 Brazilian clubs within the last 6 months, and MLS was pushing to have the Court of New York to adjudicate it.
I think it's
No, I'm
Yeah.
just realizing that there this option, and
And just to clarify, so
Yeah.
not only with the US, in general, employment-related disputes, according to the regulations, I even brought them in paper in case. And so Article 22 says that, first of all, FIFA respect the right of the parties to go to national court. So that's not at stake. What FIFA is doing is that there is an alternative solution, which is a specialized sporting body that will make a decision. But basically, if the parties will come to us and there's an international dimension, in principle, the DRC will consider themselves, the Dispute Resolution Chamber, as competent. Obviously, if the parties then raise and challenge the competence, we will then analyze the contract and whether there is this exclusive jurisdiction on way or another. But
You're saying they have to pick one or the other. If they go to the courts in their country,
Then-
they're excluded from FIFA.
Yes.
But if they go to you, then they're in your system.
exactly, that's basically saying you cannot have
You pick
both
one,
ways,
okay.
right? If you want to use the system, then you also need to be obliged by it.
Right.
So basically, that's the idea.
And in the recent cases you've had, I'm just curious, is it MLS who is the party, or is it the member clubs like FC Dallas?
Okay. So this is first of all, according to the procedural rules, leagues cannot be parties before FIFA. That was already before, and now with the new procedural rules on the Football Tribunal, which became operative last October, Article 9 again says the same. So it's players, coaches, member associations with coaches and clubs, but leagues are not parties.
Right, okay.
And on top of that, Article 22, which talks about competence, talk about employment-related disputes with clubs and players. And here, if I can continue, I imagine you would speak about that. The few decisions that we had, and first of all, everything that I'm saying here, regulations, decisions, they're all published in the legal portal of FIFA. So if you're interested and wanted to understand more about the system, you can see everything in there. And we did have a few cases where either MLS tried a larger claim or the claimant party tried to bring MLS to the discussion. And at least at the FIFA level, it's been confirmed we are not competent. MLS cannot be a party. And for us, it's basically, not for us, for the deciding body, reality takes precedence over the legal, meaning doing a parallel, not only MLS, but we have, for example, with coaches, sometimes the contract, the member association is signed with the Ministry of Sports, or we have clubs that actually the company signs the contract. But for us, we basically see who is the player registered with in the transfer matching system, who is the player rendering service for. And so we had already 2 decisions where the DRC said the beneficiary is the club is the party, entitlement and also obligations and rights. And it was considered that MLS was playing a role of an agent on behalf of the club. So basically to say, with all the respect, with the single entity, for FIFA and the dispute resolution system, it's considered that the club is the one that has obligations towards the player.
Mark, just what
Sorry,
is this
now
you-
just to
No, sure.
and just also not to sell the system, but to say is the same importance for training compensation and solidarity mechanism. We take what is in TMS. So also if this is not reflected, then the clubs will not be entitled. We had cases where we had to reject the claim because they were not. So it's important to understand that if they're not in the system, they're not going to be entitled to receive their rights.
Mark, I saw somewhere that you answered a question or an interview with you that you said that you think that, I think your season follows the calendar year, right? Here, as we do in Brazil. Yeah. But you think the season should be adapted to should be more or less the same of the big leagues in Europe. Why is that? You think that would improve your...
I think as a league, as we're trying to become more entrenched in the global transfer market, I think to align ourselves with the rest of the world makes complete sense, because at the moment, if we sell our best player, we're selling him in the middle of a season.
Yeah.
So unless that club has got a succession plan or they recruit correctly, they're gonna lose out. So I think for me, having already sort of worked in England and Europe, and I personally feel that as America is developing and as it's selling more and more talent abroad, I think we have to be aligned.
Okay. Richard, what else we have to do to make it even better, this growth, or faster?
Sort of tying up the last thing, and just from my perspective, and then I'll go to your question, is, listen, in general, as a player, agent, player, lawyer, things that sort of restrict or prohibit or limit player movement, player compensation, whether it's training comp, solidarity payments, transfer windows, in general, those are things I'm against, right? Now, I also understand that we operate in a structure and we operate in a global game. And listen, I think that if you look at where the sport is today versus it was even 3 years ago versus 10, 20 years ago, the growth that's happened is tremendous, right? You know, I've been doing this before MLS started, right? And the league at the turn of the century was teetering on collapsing, and now you've got 28 teams and a couple more coming, and the USL growing and trying to establish itself really as the second division, and in certain ways trying to challenge the MLS model. And so I think that, you know, things are moving in a great direction, and that the more opportunities there are for everybody, not just players, right? Whether they're team executives, league executives, marketing partners, the sport's on a really good path. But I also think it's complicated because we're in this global game. There are international rules, there are domestic rules, and so, you know, part of all of our jobs is just to be on top of the rules and regulations all the time. They're always changing, and you know, and that's how you sort of best represent whatever constituency you know, you're advocating for.
Okay. André, for instance, in Brazil, you had to deal with many other challenges. For instance, you don't have relegation here. So that makes more comfortable to develop, to plan the job. What do you see the difference between the reality? You won important, very important titles. Unfortunately, on behalf of my arch rival Grêmio, he won Libertadores de America, unfortunately, but I have to applaud him, and other successes that you had there. But the challenges there, they had our nature. For instance, just picking relegation, do you think it's good for the development of a league not having relegation, for instance? And besides that, what else do you think that should be improved?
So it's tough to compare, because in here in the U.S. you're in the system, the whole sports system, and MLS, where MLS is and you see NFL, you see NBA, MLB, and there are a lot of similarities there. So it's a closed league, and a number of teams that you can add more teams. Like you can have expansion teams, as we call here, coming as we did this year with Charlotte, next year with St. Louis. So when I came here, the reality, I understand, it doesn't, obviously when we are working in this market, we are competitors, we want to win. We have, different from Brazil, we have here the playoffs. So there's a lot of pressure for us to be in the playoffs, to reach the playoffs. And obviously, not having a relegation, I don't feel it makes any club more comfortable, and not, but it's just a different reality. And we have the other types of pressure that we have to deal with. But the model, and where MLS is, and where the sports in the US, I think it fits the way the public is used to, what the public is used to watch, and what the clubs are used to deal with, those trades that we were talking. So there are a lot of specificities in MLS that is different from what I was used to. And especially, as you know well, the politics involved, yeah. And as Richard's like, we have politics everywhere, but the level of the politics in clubs in South America, it's ridiculous. So here, where you can
and the non-professionalism also.
Just to give you an example, we recently hired a new coach, and it's the 4th coach in 14 years of the club. So that you have 4 coaches in 1 year in a club in Brazil.
No,
right?
to make it clear, I was not criticizing the fact that there doesn't exist a relegation, because for sure that makes you can plan it better. So you see, the reality in Brazil is that the clubs, a coach stays there for a year, it's a success already. So I think that this stability of the system will be key for the success of the leagues here in America too. I'm sure of that. Richard was calling my attention since yesterday that I should save a lot of time for you guys. So if anyone has a question to address or a statement to make, since it's a short one, you are more than invited. Anyone want to join us? Just a second, I think. There's a micro? Yeah. Please say your name and where you're from.
My name is Jordan. I'm from Salt Lake City, and my question is for Mark. With USL and the MLS parting ways, we're talking about transfers and everything like that. What is USL doing to buy players, to bring more interest to the USL as it's starting to compete with the MLS?
In terms of buying players in, or just developing and bringing them through in general?
I guess both, just to bring increased interest with the USL, right? Because most of the market is towards the MLS, but since USL and MLS just parted ways and it's no longer a lower division for the MLS, how are you trying to increase the popularity with bringing in players?
Okay, I think the easiest way to answer that is the fact that the USL is giving 18, 19, 20, 17-year-old kids, teenagers, the opportunity to play in front of 8, 10, 12,000 people against, and that pathway for a player to play 30, 60, 90 games is crucial to the development for them to have an ongoing career. So I think our USP at the moment is the fact that we have the ability to put an 18-year-old in the first team, to keep them in the first team, even when they're making the small mistakes that every young player is going to make, not take them out and keep them playing. And then the pathway is there now. The sales to Europe, to the rest of the world, they're growing, and you'll see more and more coming through the pipeline in the next few months. So I think that is what is attracting the players, potentially not to go to the bright lights of the MLS, because it's a harder pathway for them to get through to the first team, but to see the USL as that real opportunity at that moment and gives them the potential to move abroad.
And I'll add one thing to that too, which is for young players, they need to play, and they need, that a lot of the young players who come up and they sign pro contracts, they're used to being the star when they were younger, 14, 15, 16 years old. And now in most cases with MLS first teams, they're not playing, right? And so it's not just the physical part, it's the mental part too, because, for those who've played at the highest level, it's the mental part is as important as the physical part. And so to have a place to play and to have a place to continue to develop, it really is critically important. In the past, we've had a lot of our players who were on MLS first teams who weren't getting minutes also get loaned down to the USL and all of a sudden get their mojo back and then become, productive players when they return to their first teams. And now, listen, everything's continuing to change. MLS is now, was part of USL, and they're starting their own MLS Next Pro. But again, for the time being, for young players to have the ability to play in USL, if they're not playing, first division somewhere else, is a really important opportunity and has paid dividends for a lot of players.
How you doing? My name is Mauricio Wilson from Footballer and the Crack Podcast. I'd like to talk a little bit about the homegrown. Obviously, every year we're seeing more and more homegrowns getting signed at a younger age. but often we're seeing these homegrowns are not making it to the first team. I'm a little bit concerned that they're losing their amateur status, and they never get a chance to flourish, get to the first team, and they can't play college. Is there any concern or any discussion or difference between the MLS and USL? How are you dealing with that? Thank you.
We have a relationship with Bellevue University, so each of our clubs can provide an educational program that gets a player a degree. So in that respect, we're acknowledging that can happen, and that's why we've built this relationship with Bellevue to make sure that players can still get that educational pathway if they so desire. I don't know what they do in the MLS, Andre.
Yeah, so MLS also has a relationship with the University of South Carolina, and so we can also provide the players education pathway. But obviously this is a big concern for us. It's a big responsibility when you offer a player a contract, a professional contract, because he loses the college eligibility once he signs his contract. So we discuss a lot when we offer a player contract, and we discuss a lot with the agents about what would be the pathway, what we have in mind for that player, because it's a big challenge here when you're offering the player and suddenly we had Tanner Tessman. That was a case that I had to meet with his parents. He had a full ride scholarship to Clemson, which is one of the best colleges in the country, to play soccer and to be the kicker in football for the college. And I had 2 or 3 meetings with his family to convince him that we were sure that Tanner had a pathway, that Tanner was a talent, that he would be integrated. And I can, well, we are one of the clubs that, we are the club that signed more homegrowns in the history of MLS, and we play those homegrowns a lot. So the last 3 games of this season, our midfield was with 3 homegrowns, 2 of them represented by Richard here. So we understand this, and we know the responsibility of this. But in the case of Tanner that I was mentioning, luckily he did really well with us, and he was then transferred to Serie A in Italy. He's now playing for Venezia. So, yeah, but it's really challenging.
And I'll just add, it's an excellent question, and I think that what's happened historically over time, there was very few signed, and then some players went overseas, straight overseas as opposed to signing in MLS. And I think the knee-jerk and understandable reaction from the league was, okay, we can't have those players signing overseas at first, so they've signed more and more. And listen, from our role as an agent, it's a huge responsibility for us too. And so everybody's situation is individual, and you've got to deal with them case by case. Whether it's a socioeconomic background, whether it's, the importance of education. And it's, when we go through this process for the kids that we sign, we feel that responsibility too. And, there are plenty of times too where we advise the family and say, you know what, even though you have this offer, it's not a good enough offer to give up a full ride college scholarship. And now there's always the different balance, because, the truth is, if you want a career as a professional soccer player, that you're going to develop better and quicker in the professional system than you will in college. That being said, talking about the sort of mental and maturity piece, a lot of these kids at a young age aren't ready for it. So, going from an amateur player to a professional player requires a lot of maturity, not just physical maturity, emotional maturity, intellectual, social. So, you're never going to get it right all the time on either side. But we certainly do our best to make sure that at every level, when we do have kids that do sign homegrown, it's the right deal, the right opportunity, the right time with the right support to make sure they have the best chance to succeed, not only in soccer, but in life.
One more question I think we have there.
Yep.
Oh, 2 more questions, and then we have to wrap it up.
Giorgio Anton Girolami, originally from Italy, but now a Kansas Cityan. My question is this: what is the value of MLS in terms of player? Who decides that for both the selling component, but also the training compensation component? Where does the level stand? If it's a level 1, 2, 3 from the FIFA? What do I mean? a 15 years old, grow up in Italy for Lazio, gets training compensation of a certain level. What about for FC Dallas? Second question is, who decides the Ricardo Pepi transfer, or the Reynolds or Busio, if there is a trade in the league, and then there is a money value to go overseas? Do you understand the mathematical question?
I couldn't hear.
Well,
Yes, can you say it again, but more?
sure.
Louder.
So,
Yeah.
louder, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you, scusa. A training compensation, what is the level of an American player? Such as, you grow up 5 years in Italy, you have a training level, so you get training compensation, correct? Or am I wrong? Compared to an American player. Second, who decides if Pepe is sold for 20 millions when, for example, there is a trade in the league for zero money, but just a location? You know, now next year, Ricardo Pepi scores 0 goals. Will the value of MLS go up or down because he didn't perform there? Compared to Jesus Ferreira, that is playing MLS and wants to go overseas. So my question is, each league has kind of a market value. Yeah, I don't know if I'm too confused in this question, but
one's yours.
starting from the training compensation.
Okay, for FIFA, in the FIFA level, there's 2 different training rewards. So we have training compensation and solidarity mechanism. So to make a difference there, the solidarity mechanism is a percentage of the transfer. So whenever a player is transferred for an amount of money, so during the contract, 5% of this transfer is deducted and is distributed amongst the clubs that train that player from the age of 12 to 23, and that's the importance of having in the player passport. So then for us is, what is the amount of the transfer that is determined by the club and the league? We don't enter into that, but this amount is reflected in the transfer matching system with a copy of the transfer agreement, and with this, 5% is calculated and distributed based on the years that the player was trained with the different clubs. Training compensation is different. So training compensation, the idea is to not be an advantage for big clubs to just get clubs trained, you know, in small clubs, South America. So the idea is that the club will have to pay the amount of they would invest if they had trained the club itself. So then there is a table that is different by confederations, and it depends on the category of the club. So as you know, clubs can be category 1 to 4, and then seeing in TMS, we're gonna use that table to say how much is payable.
On the first professional contract.
On the first professional contract. So training compensation is the first time the players signs a professional contract overseas. So if it's nationally, it's not the same. So once it's transferred outside, it will trigger the payment of training compensation the first time to all the clubs that train the player from 12 to 21. If the player is transferred before the age of 23, sorry if it's too technical. But then after that, only whenever the player is transferred, only the last club will receive, but again, only until 23rd. Solidarity mechanism, which I said is the 5%, this is paid for the entire career of the player whenever he's transferred during a contract and a transfer fee is paid. So it's a case-by-case basis. And just to advance a bit, the ones that knows, currently FIFA together with the stakeholder is discussing the transfer system, and there's a reform of the transfer system, and training rewards is on the table. So also to try to see, because the amounts we're talking about in training compensation dates back to 2001. So we're seeing not only the amounts, but also maybe perhaps changing the system and having a different way of calculating and categorizing clubs. And the second part of it is that FIFA will most likely this year approve the regulations of clearinghouse, which means that you no longer have to request this, but it's going to be automatically paid every time a transfer triggers payment of solidarity and training.
This class about solidarity mechanism and training compensation, I needed like 5 hours to understand. So, and I've been working with that for the last 20 years, and still I got surprised with some decisions that we received. So it's not that easy as Erica is trying to make it seems. But your question has to do with the one that I provoked them before, because we were spoken before in the backstage, and I'm finishing, Mark, that there will be trades between clubs. And a South American club will want FIFA, and we as lawyers of South American clubs, we will have to try to attribute value to this trade, to calculate the percentage, 1%, 2%. It's going to be challenging, because this asset, for instance, to trade a player for the first option in the draft, how much, what's the value? But I don't have any doubt that is an asset. There is a financial representation on this deal. And me, as a creditor, I want to share a piece of this pie. So I have to finish
just
15 seconds, because Mark is killing me, Eric.
It's just that this we had already also in Europe, when we have exchange of players, and then is the job of the lawyers and representatives to determine what was this trade and what is the value market of the player, and then actually solidarity was, applied based on what was proved to be the value. So I guess it would be a similar way of approaching it, although
since Brazilian and South American clubs are always trying to get these nickels, which are not nickels for our survival, so we are very creative in this kind of issues.
And just to answer the second part of his question, the decision of the price of the players from the club. The club decides, obviously, we discuss with the league, but in the end, it's the club's decision what the price we're going to ask for a player transfer.
I would humbly request you to give a round of applause for our stellar team here, and thank you very much for being here with us.